Grace Donnelly thought she was just doing the right thing when she defended a Marine Veteran Service dog from an aggressive health inspector. Her corporate boss fired her on the spot in front of everyone, but 30 minutes later, 4 military Humvees rolled into the parking lot and everything changed forever. The Mason mug sat on the corner of Main Street and Veterans Boulevard in Mason, Georgia. Its weathered brick facade and hand-painted sign welcoming visitors to what locals called the heart of the community. Just 15 miles from Fort Granger, one of the largest Marine Corps bases in the Southeast, the Café had become an unofficial gathering place where the civilian and military worlds intersected over coffee and conversation. The morning sun streamed through large windows, illuminating mismatched furniture that gave the place a homey feel, while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sound of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of ceramic mugs. Grace Donnelly moved behind the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had found her calling in service to others. At 35, she possessed the kind of warm presence that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting her. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her apron bore the faded stains of countless busy mornings. But her green eyes held a depth that spoke of both profound loss and determined hope. 6 years earlier, Grace had been a Marine wife, proud and supportive as her husband, Sergeant Michael Donnelly, deployed to Afghanistan. When the notification officers arrived at her door with news of his death, Grace's world had shattered completely. But instead of retreating into grief, she had channeled her pain into purpose, using Michael's life insurance to purchase the Mason mug and transform it into something more than just a business. The Café had become a sanctuary for veterans returning from Fort Granger, a place where they could find understanding without judgment and community without pretense. Grace knew every regular customer by name, remembered their coffee preferences, and more importantly, she remembered their stories. She understood the invisible wounds that many carried, the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life, and the simple human need to be seen and valued. Every Wednesday morning, Grace hosted Heroes Hour, an informal gathering where veterans could connect with each other and find the camaraderie that many missed from their military service. It was during one of these gatherings that Grace's commitment to her veteran community would be tested in ways she never anticipated. The corporate owners of the Mason mug had been pressuring her to increase profits and reduce what they saw as unnecessary community programs. They viewed her dedication to veterans as a distraction from the business of selling coffee, not understanding that her mission was exactly what made the Café successful and meaningful to the community it served. The Wednesday morning that would change everything began like any other Hero's Hour. Grace had arrived early to prepare the Café, setting up the large corner table that the veterans had claimed as their own, and brewing the extra strong coffee that former Marines seemed to prefer. The familiar faces began filtering in around 8 o'clock. Retired Gunnery Sergeant Williams, who always ordered black coffee and shared stories about his grandchildren. Corporal Martinez, who was studying engineering on the GI Bill, and Staff Sergeant Johnson, who still struggled with crowds but found peace in the Café's welcoming atmosphere. At 8:30, a new face appeared in the doorway. Ray McMillan was clearly a veteran. His bearing, his careful scan of the room, and his obvious discomfort in unfamiliar surroundings all marked him as someone still adjusting to civilian life. But what made his entrance remarkable was his companion, a beautiful German shepherd, wearing a service dog vest, alert and perfectly trained, staying close to Ray's left side. Grace immediately recognized the signs of a combat veteran dealing with invisible wounds. Ray's hypervigilance, the way he positioned himself with his back to the wall, and his obvious dependence on his service dog, all spoke of someone who had seen too much and was working hard to find his place in a world that often didn't understand his struggles. Grace approached Ray with the same gentle warmth she extended to all her veteran customers. "Welcome to the Mason Mug," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Grace. This is a safe space for heroes, and that includes your partner there." She gestured toward the German shepherd, who looked up at her with intelligent brown eyes. Ray's tension visibly decreased at her words. "This is Shadow," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We're still figuring things out together." Grace nodded with understanding. She had seen enough veterans with service dogs to know that these partnerships were often lifelines for men and women struggling with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and other invisible wounds of war. "Shadow is welcome here any time," Grace assured him. "Let me get you both settled at our veterans table. Coffee's on the house for first-time visitors, and we've got some folks here who understand what you're going through." As Grace led Ray and Shadow to the corner table, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from connecting veterans with their community. The Mason Mug wasn't just serving coffee, it was serving healing one cup and one conversation at a time. But Grace had no idea that her simple act of hospitality was about to be challenged in ways that would test everything she believed about doing what was right. Ray had just settled into his chair, Shadow lying calmly beside him, when the cafe's peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the arrival of Logan Prescott, a state health inspector whose reputation for aggressive enforcement preceded him. Prescott strode through the door with the self-important bearing of someone who enjoyed wielding authority over small business owners, his clipboard in hand, and his expression already disapproving. "Excuse me," Prescott announced loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet conversations. "There's an animal in this food service establishment which is a clear violation of health codes. That dog needs to be removed immediately." Grace stepped forward calmly, her years of dealing with difficult situations evident in her composed demeanor. "Sir, that's a service dog. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, service animals are permitted in all public accommodations, including restaurants." But Prescott was not interested in legal technicalities. "I don't care what kind of dog it is," he snapped. "Animals don't belong where food is served. Remove it now, or I'll shut this place down for health code violations." The cafe fell silent as every customer turned to watch the confrontation unfold, sensing that this moment would define what the Mason Mug truly stood for. Grace maintained her calm professionalism despite Prescott's aggressive tone. "Sir, I understand your concern for health standards, but federal law is very clear about service animals. This dog is working not just a pet, and his veteran handler has every right to be here with his service animal." Ray had gone rigid in his chair, Shadow sensing his handler's distress and moving closer to provide comfort. The other veterans at the table watched with growing anger as they recognized the familiar pattern of a civilian authority figure treating one of their own with disrespect and ignorance. "I don't care about federal law," Prescott declared, his voice rising. "I'm here to enforce state health codes, and those codes don't allow animals in food service establishments. Either the dog goes, or I'm writing citations that will cost you thousands of dollars." Grace felt her resolve strengthening. She had built the Mason Mug as a sanctuary for veterans, a place where they would never face the kind of discrimination and misunderstanding that too many experienced in the civilian world. "Mr. Prescott, I'm not removing a service dog from my establishment. Shadow is here legally, and his handler deserves the same respect and accommodation that we would provide to anyone else." The confrontation was escalating, and Grace knew that her next words would determine whether she stood by her principles or capitulated to bureaucratic bullying. The situation took a dramatic turn when Deborah Lyle, regional manager for the corporate chain that owned the Mason Mug, walked through the door. Grace's heart sank as she saw Lyle's expression. The woman had clearly heard the commotion and was already calculating the potential liability and bad publicity that could result from defying a health inspector. "What's going on here?" Lyle demanded, her tone making it clear that she blamed Grace for whatever problem had developed. Prescott immediately launched into his complaint, describing Grace's refusal to comply with health regulations and her argumentative attitude toward legitimate authority. Lyle didn't even ask for Grace's side of the story. Instead, she turned to Ray and said coldly, "Sir, you'll need to remove your animal from the premises immediately. We can't have dogs in a food service establishment." Ray started to explain about Shadow being a service dog, but Lyle cut him off. "I don't care what kind of dog it is. Our insurance doesn't cover incidents involving animals, and we can't risk a health department citation." The veterans at the corner table were now openly angry, recognizing that their community was being betrayed by the very business they had supported. Grace realized that she was facing a choice between her job and her principles. Grace looked around the cafe at the faces of the veterans she had served for years, men and women who had sacrificed for their country only to face discrimination and misunderstanding at home. She thought of her husband, Michael, who had died believing that America was worth fighting for, and she knew what he would expect her to do. "Ms. Lyall," Grace said quietly, "Shadow is a service dog protected by federal law. Ray is a Marine veteran who served our country, and he deserves our respect and accommodation, not discrimination." Lyle's face flushed with anger. "Grace, you're creating a liability issue and defying a health inspector. If you don't remove that dog immediately, you're fired." The cafe fell completely silent. Even Prescott seemed surprised by the escalation. Grace looked at Ray, who was struggling to control his emotions, at Shadow, who was providing the comfort and stability that allowed his handler to function in civilian society, and at the other veterans who were watching to see whether their sanctuary would survive this test. "Then I guess I'm fired," Grace said simply. She untied her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. "Ray Shadow, you're welcome to stay as long as you want. This is your place, too." As Grace walked toward the door, the veterans began standing up one by one, preparing to follow her out in solidarity. Grace's firing sent shockwaves through the veteran community faster than anyone could have anticipated. Corporal Martinez, who had been quietly recording the confrontation on his phone, immediately posted the video to social media with the caption, "This is how America treats its heroes." Within minutes, the video was being shared across veteran networks, military spouse groups, and social media platforms. The footage showed Grace's calm dignity in the face of bureaucratic bullying, her unwavering support for a veteran's rights, and the corporate manager's callous disregard for both federal law and basic human decency. Comments poured in from veterans across the country who had faced similar discrimination from military families who recognized the importance of service dogs, and from civilians who were outraged by the treatment of both Grace and Ray. At Fort Granger, the video reached the command structure within an hour. Colonel Richard Gaines, the base commander, watched it 3 times before calling his aide-de-camp. "Get me everything we know about this Grace Donnelly," he ordered, "and find out what we can do about this situation. A Marine veteran and his service dog were just discriminated against in our backyard, and a good woman lost her job for doing the right thing." The military was about to respond in a way that no one expected. Grace sat in her car in the Mason Muggs parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, she had lost the job that had given her life meaning and purpose after Michael's death. The cafe that she had transformed into a community sanctuary was now under the control of people who didn't understand or care about its mission. Through the windshield, she could see Lyle inside talking animatedly with Prescott, while Ray sat alone at the corner table, shadow pressed close to his side. The other veterans had left in disgust, their sanctuary violated by corporate indifference and bureaucratic overreach. Grace felt the weight of failure settling on her shoulders. She had let down the community that had become her family. But as she sat there contemplating her uncertain future, Grace became aware of a sound that didn't belong in the quiet Georgia morning. It was a low rumble growing louder that spoke of power and purpose. She looked up to see 4 military Humvees turning into the parking lot, their olive drab paint and military markings unmistakable against the civilian landscape. The vehicles arranged themselves in a precise formation, and Grace watched in amazement as uniformed Marines began emerging from each one. These weren't just any Marines. Their bearing their equipment and their obvious sense of mission indicated that something significant was happening. At the head of the formation walked a tall officer, whose eagles indicated the rank of full colonel, his dress blue uniform immaculate, and his expression determined. Colonel Richard Gaines strode through the door of the Mason Mug with a kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Behind him came 20 Marines in dress uniforms, their precision and discipline transforming the casual cafe atmosphere into something that resembled a military ceremony. Every conversation stopped as the unexpected visitors took control of the space. Lyle's face went white as she realized that her morning had just become infinitely more complicated. Prescott looked around nervously, suddenly uncertain about his authority in the face of military intervention. But Colonel Gaines ignored both of them, walking directly to where Ray sat with Shadow, his focus entirely on the veteran who had been mistreated. "Sergeant McMillan," the colonel said, rendering a crisp salute to the surprised veteran. "I'm Colonel Gaines, commanding officer of Fort Granger. I understand you and your partner were subjected to discrimination here today." Ray struggled to his feet, overwhelmed by the unexpected show of support. "Yes, sir. But it's handled now." "No, Sergeant, it's not handled," Colonel Gaines replied firmly. "When a Marine veteran and his service dog are discriminated against, and when a civilian who stands up for what's right gets punished for it, that's when the Marine Corps steps in to remind people what honor looks like." The colonel turned to address the entire cafe, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ladies and gentlemen, this establishment has failed to show proper respect to a veteran who served our country with distinction. More importantly, it has punished someone who demonstrated the kind of moral courage that we try to instill in every Marine. Lyle tried to interrupt, but Colonel Gaines continued without acknowledging her. Therefore, effective immediately, Fort Granger is taking administrative control of this facility to ensure that it operates in a manner consistent with the values that Sergeant McMillan and thousands of others have fought to defend. What happened next was unprecedented in the annals of civilian-military relations. The Marines, acting with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation, began systematically removing every corporate logo poster and sign that identified the Mason mug as part of the chain that had just fired Grace. In their place, they installed a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome to Grace's Place, where honor is served daily." Colonel Gaines approached the stunned Lyle with a document that his aide had prepared during the drive from Fort Granger. "Ma'am, you'll find that the lease on this property includes a clause allowing the adjacent military installation to assume operational control in cases of discrimination against service members. That clause is now being invoked." Prescott tried to assert his authority, waving his clipboard and citing health regulations, but found himself facing a Marine gunnery sergeant who politely but firmly escorted him to the door with the suggestion that he might want to review federal laws regarding service animals before conducting future inspections. Within an hour, the Mason mug had been transformed into Grace's Place, operated under military oversight, and dedicated to serving the veteran community with the respect and dignity they deserved. But the most important transformation was yet to come. Colonel Gaines found Grace still sitting in her car watching the transformation of her former workplace with a mixture of amazement and uncertainty. He approached her vehicle with the respectful bearing he would show to any civilian who had demonstrated exceptional character under pressure. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, as Grace rolled down her window, "I'm Colonel Gaines from Fort Granger. I believe we need to talk." Grace stepped out of her car, still trying to process the surreal scene unfolding around her. "Colonel, I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't understand why. I just did what anyone should do. I stood up for a veteran's rights." "Ma'am, that's exactly why we're here," Colonel Gaines replied. "What you did today represents the kind of moral courage that the Marine Corps tries to instill in every one of our Marines. You faced pressure threats to your livelihood and bureaucratic bullying, but you never wavered in doing what was right. That's the definition of honor." He gestured toward the cafe where Marines were completing the transformation from corporate chain to community sanctuary. "We've been trying to establish a veteran transition center for years, but we'd never found the right person to run it. Someone who understands what our veterans need, someone who can create the kind of environment where healing and community can flourish." Grace looked at the cafe that had been her life's work, now flying American flags and displaying signs that honored military service. "Colonel, I'm flattered, but I'm just a cafe owner. I don't have any special training in veteran services or military programs." "Mrs. Donnelly," Colonel Gaines said gently, "you've been running an unofficial veteran transition center for years. Every Wednesday morning, you've provided exactly what our returning Marines need most a place where they're understood, valued, and connected with others who share their experiences. You've done more for veteran mental health and community integration than most official programs manage to accomplish. He paused, watching as Ray and Shadow were surrounded by Marines who were treating both with the respect and recognition they deserved. The question isn't whether you're qualified, it's whether you're willing to make it official. We want to offer you the position of Director of the Fort Granger Veteran Transition Center, with full military support and a mandate to create the kind of program that other bases will want to replicate. The formal ceremony took place 1 week later in the main conference room at Fort Granger, with representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the state government, and military leadership from across the Southeast in attendance. Grace stood at the podium wearing a simple blue dress that Michael had bought her years earlier, facing an audience that included everyone from Marine generals to local veterans who had become her extended family. The pressure was immense. Grace was being asked to speak about her vision for veteran services to people who had dedicated their careers to military affairs, to articulate a philosophy of care and community that she had developed through instinct and experience rather than formal training. But as she looked out at the audience and saw Ray sitting in the front row with Shadow beside him, she found her voice. 6 years ago, I lost my husband to a war that most Americans have forgotten. She began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. I could have let that loss define me, could have retreated into grief and bitterness. Instead, I chose to honor his memory by serving the community he died protecting. Grace's first months as director of the Veteran Transition Center were challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. The bureaucracy of military administration was complex and often frustrating, requiring reports, assessments, and documentation that seemed to interfere with the simple human connections that made her work effective. Some veteran service organizations questioned whether a civilian, even one with her experience, could truly understand the needs of military personnel. There were budget constraints, regulatory requirements, and political pressures that threatened to transform her community-based approach into just another institutional program. But Grace persevered, applying the same principles that had made the Mason Mug successful. She insisted on knowing every veteran who came through the center, personally remembering their stories, their struggles, and their strengths. She created programs based on what veterans actually needed rather than what bureaucrats thought they should need, and she fought tirelessly to maintain the personal, community-oriented approach that made healing possible. The breakthrough came during the center's first major crisis, when a young Marine named Tommy Reeves came to Grace in the midst of a severe PTSD episode, convinced that he was a danger to himself and others. Traditional protocol would have required immediate psychiatric intervention and possible hospitalization. But Grace recognized that what Tommy needed most was human connection and understanding. She spent the entire night with Tommy and his family, not as a program director, but as someone who understood loss and trauma. She shared her own story of grief and recovery, connected Tommy with other veterans who had faced similar struggles, and helped him understand that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. Tommy's recovery became a model for the center's approach to veteran mental health, personal, community-based, and focused on building connections rather than simply treating symptoms. Word of Grace's innovative methods spread throughout the military community, and the Fort Granger Center began receiving requests for consultation from bases across the country. Within 2 years, Grace had transformed a simple idea into a national model for veteran services, proving that sometimes the most effective solutions come from the heart rather than the handbook. The culmination of Grace's work came when she received the Presidential Citizens Medal, the nation's second highest civilian honor, for her exceptional service to veterans. The ceremony took place in the Rose Garden with Ray and Shadow in attendance as honored guests representing the thousands of veterans whose lives had been transformed by Grace's dedication. In her acceptance speech, Grace spoke about the lessons she had learned from her firing at the Mason Mug. Sometimes doing what's right costs us everything we think we want, but it gives us everything we actually need. I lost a job that day, but I found my true calling. I learned that honor isn't just earned on battlefields, it's demonstrated every day in how we treat those who have served, how we stand up for what's right, and how we choose community over convenience. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Grace, it was for every person who had chosen principle over profit, courage over comfort. The story of Grace's firing and the Marine Corps' response became a viral sensation, generating millions of views and sparking a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. The video of Colonel Gaines and his Marines transforming the Mason Mug into Grace's place was shared by everyone from military families to civilian supporters, becoming a symbol of what happens when institutions fail to live up to their values. Deborah Lyle was quietly reassigned within her corporate structure, while Logan Prescott faced a formal review of his enforcement practices that revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward service members and their families. The corporate chain that had owned the Mason Mug implemented new policies regarding service animals and veteran accommodation, using Grace's story as a training example for managers across their system. Most importantly, Ray McMillan became a spokesperson for service dog awareness, working with Grace to educate businesses and organizations about the rights of veterans with disabilities and the importance of creating welcoming communities for those who have served. Grace's Veteran Transition Center became the gold standard for military-civilian cooperation in veteran services, with over 50 similar programs established at bases across the country within 5 years. Her community-based approach to veteran mental health was adopted by the Department of Veterans Affairs as a best practice, and her training materials were used to educate civilian communities about supporting military families. The center's success led to Grace being appointed to the Presidential Advisory Committee on Veteran Services, where she advocated for policies that prioritized human connection and community support over bureaucratic solutions. Her work influenced legislation that improved funding for veteran transition programs and strengthened protections for service animals and their handlers. Perhaps most significantly, Grace's story inspired thousands of civilians to become more actively involved in supporting veterans in their communities, creating a grassroots movement that bridged the gap between military and civilian America in ways that formal programs had never achieved. 5 years after being fired from the Mason Mug, Grace stood in the main hall of the Fort Granger Veteran Transition Center, watching as Ray McMillan graduated from the center's peer counselor program. Shadow now, a senior service dog, sat proudly beside his handler as Ray prepared to help other veterans navigate their own transitions to civilian life. "You know," Ray said to Grace after the ceremony, "that day in the cafe changed both our lives. You lost a job, but you found your mission." Grace smiled, watching as dozens of veterans and their families celebrated together. Sometimes the best things come from the worst moments. We just have to be brave enough to see the opportunity.